Hello, everybody, and welcome to Inclusively. And I'm Monica Paolini, and I'm here with Chris Lewis, my co-host, and Frazer McKimm, and who has been doing a lot of work on inclusivity. And today we're going to talk on a somewhat of a different, we're going to take a different angle from the one we often taken in the past, which is how to help people with disabilities, often in at home or wherever they are. Today we're going to talk about what happens to people with disabilities when they go out, and that's really important because when you're disabled, you want to be able to go out in the city, interact with people, move around. And so what Fraser has been doing a lot of work is to work on the smart city side of things. So how can smart city can be smart for disabled people as well? So with that, Fraser, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us how you got interested in that, and then we'll go for with our discussion.
Well, my name is Frazer McKimm. I trained originally as an industrial design engineer, and then I did another degree, master's degree at the Royal College of Art in London, looking into interaction design. I became very interested in disabilities at quite an early age. I was 17, and I was brought over to help assist with people who were called handicapped at the time to bring them to Lourdes. Now, the obsessive reason was to bring them on a holiday, or for a miracle rather, but actually it was about being on a holiday and having them interact with real world. So I learned that the kids mostly had extraordinary abilities despite their disabilities, but that there was a physical barrier allowing them to interact fully in the world. So when I chose my career to study industrial design, I became very interested in the ergonomics of design, really the whole area about usability. And I kept developing that on. And then when I qualified, I went back to college after working professionally and decided I need to understand the possibilities of interaction design with digital technology for people with disabilities. So I started looking into projects that focused on those. So I was developing timepieces for blind people. I was working with people with cerebral palsy to help them train and move. I was looking at people, people in wheelchairs, how they could access, electric domestic appliances and use them. So really it started, and I've been on it for many, many years. And now, having worked more in the network end of it and the application end of technology, as well as just the products, I see a huge opportunity with smart cities, particularly with 5G IoT technologies and, using AI assisted applications for more predictive analysis and supports for people with disabilities, so we can help take them from the home, because the improvements in the home have been notable in the last 20 years, but actually getting and helping and assisting people with disabilities to live full interactive lives outside of the homes in the city and feel safe and secure is the role of technology. And for me, it's the smart in smart cities, because if it isn't inclusive for all people, it's not a smart city, basically. So everybody's talking about smart cities, but I always ask the question, smart for whom? It must be inclusive, and that's where I'm focusing to try and push this agenda forward in the construct of our next wave of smart city innovation.
So Fraser, there are two elements to that then. So one is the willingness of politicians and regulators to embrace this, and we've just gone through the launch of the European Accessibility Act, so that's one angle of it. But let's come back to that. Let's start with the technology. You mentioned 5G IoT. And obviously, as a blind person, I'm very conscious of this issue about accurate navigation, inclusive design of physical buildings and of navigation systems. Where do you see the technology then? Is it ready? Is it being used? Is it still in pockets? As you said, it's been a lot of this development has been done within the home and then in little isolated pockets. Do you see the technology being applicable easily across everything to do with the smart city?
I think the technology is absolutely there. I think multimodal voice, text, braille readers, gesture-based interfaces, I think it's all there. I think it's a question of knitting it together we have a computer in our pockets. This is the great of a smartphone. It's a question of making sure that the infrastructure, the 5G in particular, IoT, relies on sensors. So you're using, it's a data network fundamentally, and you're using sensors to monitor and measure where people are, or where cars are, or what the temperature is. So the IoT technology has generic applications, but it's particularly relevant to where it's detecting people, say, with disability. That's where the AI element would come in. An AI engine running on it would say, would understand and notify, would know that the person has a walking maybe disability or they're blind, and that's where they can then have specific supports broadcast to them through the phone, telling them, problems about issues around surface, the quality of the surface they're walking on, or predictive analysis on where there are problems coming up. And so I think that the use of navigation systems like in the vehicles, it all exists on the phone now. It's a question of making sure that the supporting IoT technology and the applications running on that network support as a priori multiple disability segments. We're not just talking about.
But isn't that the problem that people in the past we've designed things around individual disabilities? To design something inclusive like you just described, is a leap forward to. It needs to have all the different stakeholders from different disabilities organizations, from the city authorities, from planners, as well as the capital investment. And I just feel it in that, and I live in London, and I think London is
Yeah.
reasonably well integrated, but it's a real challenge because there's a lot of stakeholders there who don't necessarily have any funding to put into this.
Oh, that's you've hit the nail, you've nailed it. Yes. So the issue is it's always a question of who pays, who takes responsibility. And what's happening, I think, in smart cities and the work I've been doing in smart cities is that basically the cities are now more controlled than ever, because obviously the various European legislative directives around about giving access to infrastructure for smart city rollout using, say, lighting and street traffic lights for the radios, for the cells, as opposed to macro cells traditionally. They're having to grant access to the network operators. So the network operators, in order to deliver, because of the characteristics of 5G as opposed to 4G, we're not getting into the details of it, but basically 5G carries high amounts of data over shorter distances than 4G LTE or even 3G. So they're going to have to create a granular network infrastructure, and that puts the cities in a key position of saying, okay, we can grant you access, provided, and you supply, you accommodate these type of applications or IoT sensors. So the private enterprises that wish to build networks for autonomous vehicles, for instance, there's an obvious use for autonomous vehicles for people who need to get around, who have mobility issues, and that we're all going to face that as we get older. But there is the application of, there is now the opening for the city itself to impose these how would I say, these requirements. I mean, we do have universal design standards for inclusive design, the WCA G 2.1, so that's the web contact accessibility guidelines. That's already out there, national accessibility standards. So what you're doing is you're broadening out the concept of accessibility to sort of accessibility to the wider city environment and movability around it. And you're saying multimodal access must be incorporated, because blind people are, like some people like yourself, they need auditory supports as well as tactile, and you can use the vibrator and the phone to give an alerts, direction alerts, and all the rest of it. I've done that in the automotive industry. I built vibrating analysis into the seat for one of the automotive companies in order to alert the driver to objects coming from different sides of the car, cyclists primarily. So this technology exists and is available. To answer your question, it's a question of making sure.
Go on, Monica.
Yeah, Fraser, you're okay. I think you're back on. Now I have a question, because this seems like the whole framework and approach could be different, in the sense that instead of identifying you as a disabled person or a special type, what you would be doing is that you basically say what kind of additional help you need. Is it visual, auditory, or whatever, or all of the above? And I think that this is important because sometimes people might kind of say, "Well, I'm not disabled," or whatever. You know, it's a category thing. So you basically just say what kind of help or additional input, whatever it is, you need. So basically, would be really built in. As Chris was saying, this is not part of a special treatment. It's just everybody can use and just basically you scale what kind of needs you have. Is that true? Because I think that this is really important in the perception of
Yes, I did, and
how
I
this
mean,
is introduced from both from the government point of view, stakeholders and users.
yeah, so 100%. So for instance, it's a bit like having a nut allergy when you get on a plane. You know, they announce it. They say, you know, we have a user who has a nut allergy. Please, we're not selling nuts on this plane. So if a person has a particular disability, it's on their phone, it's embedded. They to choose what they want to put in there or what they don't want to put in there. There's obviously you have to balance. You know, you have to balance safety. You know, for instance, you know, you're saying I have smart cameras on the network, and you want you know the smart cameras like they're already having issues around anonymizing data feed because they're analyzing people. They want to analyze cities want to analyze people movement in order to determine where they're going to put, for instance, bins. You know, because they're noticing that bins are not in certain areas, are getting too full in certain. So they're analyzing where people go. They're analyzing people movement around cities in order to determine where they're going to build a pedestrian bridge across the River Liffey, for instance, by analyzing movement. Anonymizing that data is important. But if a person has a disability, it announced to the system, and the AI will pick up on that. Well, I have these requirements and these needs, and in the city, the system has a network that will be able to adapt their the root or their the Italians have a word
Yeah.
precorso.
It's sort of the ultimate ecosystem, isn't it? Because I agree that, and we'll come back to identity, I'm sure, but you know, you're building in all the systems and sensors around a city, which obviously includes lighting and transport and all those things, and you're having to have a coordinated set of data through which everyone can get access. And obviously the devices you mentioned phones. I think the other thing which is really important to think about now is that the sensors on us as individuals, you know, wearing smart glasses, wearing haptic feedback pads. You know,
Mm.
I did see, I don't know who told me, someone told me about some smart shoes. They're like overshoes that the Japanese have designed, where they give you feedback on your feet to tell you which way to walk. You know, so this, and I love this idea of this, remember the $6 million man, you know, the way we recreated Steve Austin back in the 70s or 80s, you know, to rebuild somebody. But all the sensors are there, including artificial limbs and the like. So it's the ultimate ecosystem to bring all these pieces together.
Yeah,
But to go back to my initial comment to you, the regulatory piece, do the cities, do the politicians, the people running the cities, do they have an awareness of it? Do they understand how to do it? Or who's going to do it with them? Because my personal experience is you find pockets of expertise, but actually there's nobody joins it all up.
yeah, you will find authorities like in the Ireland National Security Authority, people like that are very good at making people government policy aware. For instance, you know, in terms of access to government services online or access to government buildings and all the rest of it, they're very good at that. But ultimately, when it comes to designing complex, multimodal sort of smart cities, which crosses over many disciplines, there is a problem at the minute of like who takes overall ownership and responsibility, and I believe it has to be the city, and also they have to demonstrate the use cases to government because this is going to require government funding. Because if you're going to rely on private industry, it'll never happen. But there's also a duty on the part of other citizens and users of the city to be more aware of people with disabilities. I mean, one of the things I've seen shocking is that people are glued to their smartphones walking down the street, completely oblivious to
Yeah.
other people around them. Now, in the case of a normal health interdigital, they bump into you, as has happened to me many times, and I am guilty as you know, I'm actually guilty, and I've done it myself. I've actually even walked into a lamppost while I was looking at my smartphone. So too much to the hilarity of
Did
my companion.
did you
But
apologize to the lamppost
to the
though,
light.
Fraser? No.
No, but everybody was very much amused
Yep.
by it. But so the smart city would alert other users in the immediate. So a person who has a disability, if you bump into them, it can be actually quite a trauma. And because they don't have the reactive ability, if they're blind, or even if they have mobility, they can't move out of the way.
Yep.
So I look at this as a societal thing, whereby other people using this thing must be made more sensitive in the literal sense, whether it's a vibrating alert to alert them that they're about to walk into somebody with a disability, or to make a bit of room, because we're so focused, and so our whole, the way we are now is that we're kind of glued to our phones, and we're becoming virtualized in existing in a physical world. But actually the physical world very much is there, and particularly when you're interacting with people with disabilities. So I think that the system must make other users of the city aware when there's a person in a wheelchair who might have difficulty, because of pavement issues, or they can't avoid. So it's it's a societal thing, and the only people who can take responsibility for that are the cities themselves, and the governments and the various departments. But it has to be embedded in, okay, we're going to design a network, an IoT network, that's actually going to take the disabilities as a starting point in order for it to be a truly equitable, smart a piece of infrastructure. And yes, it's going to take more time. Yes, it's going to take a lot more effort to knit it together, a lot more trial and error, and it's going to cost more money. But if you don't do it from the beginning, as you know, as anybody's tried to retrofit a DAS a system into an old building knows, it's bloody hard when you try and retrofit certain technologies on an existing infrastructure.
But do you see the people you talk to, do you see them receptive? Because I would imagine that they will all say yes, 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 that's a
Yeah.
good idea, and then it kind of doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, I'm
Or
lobbying hard this one now, Monica, and so this is why I'm so happy to have the opportunity to come on this podcast and talk about this, because I think now is the time to push this agenda, because I'm in the process of consulting on some smart cities at the minute. So I think you have to force the issue. I'm sorry to say. I mean, there's been so many scandals over lack of care for people with disabilities at the most basic level, and so this they might consider this a priority because they don't understand technology. I'm a technologist at the end of the day. I've been living and working and using technology all my career, so I kind of have a visibility down the road, and I've kind of said to myself, well, if we don't do it now, then it'll be a kind of it'll be a patchwork effort. So I agree, it has to be lobbied hard. I believe it has to be lobbied hard.
So Fraser, in your mind, does that mean a a neutral host network for the city? Does it have to be something that everybody can use? Does it have to be consensus that all the mobile providers get together and support? And by the way, I'm assuming we're not really talking just about cities, but we're talking about villages and rural as well.
Yeah, but
So
I'm
how
not.
do we?
No,
Well,
no, please.
how do we drive that from our industry point of view? Because there is you've talked about infrastructure requirements of sensors and connectivity, but behind that is the assumption that there is a city network, or is it horses for courses? Do we put some neutral host networks in some places and run it just open competition but guaranteed coverage in others? Because if we're going to deliver the service that you described, and by the way, I often suffer that feat of people walking into me when I've got a guide dog with me. He's a 40-kilogram
Mm,
guide dog. You think people
mm.
would make notes of that, but no,
Ah, I've
they're on
seen
their
it happen.
phones. Yeah, no, it does. It's horrible. Um,
Yeah,
but
and
but yeah,
it's
so
very scary for the individual like you. I can imagine that it's
it's
a
really
shock.
it's very
Yeah,
disorientating. It really is. But my point is that in order to get to the densification of connectivity and the accuracy, because at the moment GPS is only accurate to within 10 square meters, so we have a navigation challenge. Although if we bring all the Wi-Fi and everything together, but once again, who's going to be responsible for doing all of that integration? Because it's I don't the telcos, as we know, are not making a lot of money they make good living, but they're not making excess profits like they used to. So how do you, who has responsibility for it at the infrastructure side?
Okay, so I kind of I look at this as pillars supporting the where we want to get to, and you have to have, like, there's about 7 issues that I would be dealing with. Like, for instance, there's digital accessibility, there's physical accessibility, there's inclusive data. This is where you got the bit about, there's a big push against, well, anonymized data and privacy issues and all the rest of that. There's community participation, so there's assistive technology access, and then there's safety and autonomy issues or ethical. So I just kind of, those are my back of an envelope listings of things. We can talk about each one in more detail, but basically it's not just one group. You have obviously community support, you've got government of cities. Now, smart cities are interesting, and you've raised a very valuable point there. The infrastructure for the smart cities is actually changing. We traditionally have a macro cell. Now we're looking at utilizing city infrastructure. Now, there's a directive EU 57, I believe, which it stipulates for 5G that cities must make it available to MNOs. But companies that have actual more ability to tackle that, and probably more liquidity, would be the ex-tower companies who are now moving from the macro cell to the mini cells to the micro cell. I call them traffic light, or a lighting thing as a micro cell. They actually would be putting in some of this new infrastructure. This new infrastructure typically would include a neutral host cell on it. And it would include an LED lighting unit, and it would include a cable coming out of the bottom of the thing that would connect into fiber for the backhaul. So the infrastructure companies who make long-term investments, and I'm not going to mention any names here, but there's plenty of them out there who would formerly be managing the towers. They would be critical partners in this, because they're putting in that infrastructure, and the type of sensors we're talking about would have to incorporate it into these units. And they probably quite, for instance, one of the big problems is if you want to put something on an existing lighting unit, you have to find a hole to plug into the unmetered power connection below the light switch, because, the street lights are dawn to dusk, whereas you need 24/7 power for a small cell radio. So you have to kind of fit it on a pole and drill a hole, and that's ridiculous. So what's going to happen is that there's going to be a swap in and swap out of old lighting infrastructure with new 5G infrastructure, and that's not the MNOs really. That's the infrastructure build companies, of which there's many, and they'd have to be brought into play. And as I said earlier, you'd have to get the city to draft as I said, a pillar list of things that it must do. And you would identify within, say, digital accessibility, well, WCAG compliant, that's obviously going to do with policyholders. The physical accessibility, well, that comes down to the actual units itself, like as I was saying, auditory cues, but it also comes down to the smartphone suppliers, to the MNOs, having apps already embedded on them that, as people with a disability, shouldn't have to download an app. It should be on the phone already. You download a smart city app, say, let's call it that. It should have these features already embedded in it, 100%. And the inclusive data, how you collect disability, like disaggregated data, that's going to be important. And again, that data comes from companies like Google or wherever they have that data. That data has to be shared and made available, so that independent designers can kind of come in and add in. Community participation are obviously the groups that represent people with disabilities. But I mean, I think even more broadly, we're all getting a lot older, and we're going to be living longer. And so people think about people with disabilities. We all have disabilities,
We do, we do. But
and
I
it's
take you
going to
back to
get worse.
not
Not worse, it's
to
going to get more pronounced.
and more prevalent, certainly. Take
More
you back to
prevalent, that's the word, sorry.
take you back to the sorry, you can have that one. Taking you back to the issue of identity, because you're quite right. Identity in the so-called disabled community, identifying as being disabled is a bit of a no-no.
Completely understandable, by the way.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, and yet the and I think to your point about as people get older, when do you become disabled? When do you become hearing impaired? When you start to lose your hearing? I'm losing my hearing in my right ear, so I'm very conscious now about using hearing aids. Obviously, I've been legally blind for 40 years, so that's sort of just the de facto for me.
Yeah.
But identity, and this comes in this legislate GDPR obviously is part of that. But I hear that Brussels is beginning to think about relaxing some of the GDPR issues because of innovation. It's stifling innovation. And in the AI Act, the latest rounds of that, the sort of rumors of that becoming a bit less prescriptive. So I think there's the signs that some of it is, but then it's going to come down to the disability organizations, the charities, the people representing the disabled community about how identity is used. In my mind, it can only be a positive, but I guess the good thing is you can identify on your own device, and that then identifies you. You can have like a fire break between systems, so it doesn't have to be spread around the whole system. But
It's a
you need to be identified as having a cognitive issue or a mobility issue or a hearing issue in order that the system adapts around you, whether that's, as you said, in your home or out and about or in work. So,
I mean, I think if we go back to the definition of disability, I think that's incredibly important because I think that we all suffer disabilities. In fact, the first thing I learned from people who are technically, or they say, or have disabilities, they have profound abilities in other areas that we don't.
yeah, yeah,
And I mean, I, I like my better half would say I suffer from profound marital deafness. I don't. That's a
it's a
disability.
common condition. It's a
That's a
common
common
condition.
condition,
Yeah,
But I think the issue of I think the identifying people as disabled or whatever is a really bad way of approaching it. It's not a bad way of approaching it, but I hate definitions and terms because I see people have one disability, but they have compensatory abilities
exactly.
in other areas. A
And
friend of
also
mine
to your
has
um,
one friend of mine has one ear, and his hearing in the one ear is unbelievably better than anybody I know
mm,
in terms of his ability to pick up things. So his brain is compensated, and the one ear he has, it is remarkable. So we do compensate. The brain is a remarkable organ; it can actually overcome many things. And so I think yes, you have to leave it to the individuals to decide where they want to be. In terms of when they go out into the city. So when I'm venturing out into the city, I decide what I'm going to wear. And if I want to wear certain aspects of my disability on me so that I am broadcasting that to aid my navigation through the city, that's my decision and my choice.
mm,
But I do believe there is an obligation, and it's incumbent on the people who are managing these technologies and designing them that it's fully inclusive from the start. So
yeah.
comprehensively, you have basically a spec sheet for what it must do, and then leave it up to the individual to decide and use it as they wish. It's the individual's choice, and obviously the data needs to be anonymized.
And
But
perhaps they'll be surprised, right? So one of our colleagues in the industry was telling me how he started using the AirPod Pros because they've got like a hearing aid feature in them, but he's using
yeah,
them to listen to TV with his wife. I said, mate, you need
yeah,
hearing aids. He said, no, I don't. I said, you just told me you do. But of course, because it's a consumer electronics thing, he thinks it's all right. Whereas the hearing aid, as we know, they have stigmas attached with using stuff. So I think there's a
yeah.
lot around individuals identifying as well as identity as being an issue from a technology point of view.
Yeah, and if I can say that, so this is actually an issue that Chris and I talked a lot about. Is that just say you become older and we all gonna be disabled one way or another. I mean, that's the way we are talking about ourselves, but that's not how people see themselves. So you see themselves like yourself are getting older, say, oh, I don't hear very well, I don't see very well, or whatever. And so I think that we should just have this kind of more inclusive type of approach to the fact that you're not 100% capable of doing the same things that you were doing earlier or whatever. So it's a spectrum. So you need to again, you need to balance because our digital ID is becoming so important and pervasive. So we need to have a different way to define it, and it's not just disability; it's across the board. Is how much you want to share, how do you see yourself? And so and then that's a way to remove the stigma that unfortunately is still there, and we can try to address it, but we can't solve. I mean, I think it's better to just let people do whatever they want. So I think that this is really important. I mean, which is interesting because we always think that the technology and the cost is limiting factor, but sometimes it's really cultural.
Absolutely. And in fact, you know, as cities like basically adopt smart technologies, which are going to happen anyway because it's going to be pushed on us, whether we like it or not, it's happening. But I think there's a critical need to ensure that the all this innovation doesn't deepen existing inequalities. And this is the threat, is that technology can deepen inequalities. So it has to be, and you're talking about marginalized. At the end of the day, we're talking about marginalized users, which is a very broad spectrum. Very elderly people are marginalized users, and they're afraid of coming into the cities because they feel threatened and vulnerable. So it has to be. I think it has to be. Policy objectives have to ensure, for digital smart cities, they have to ensure universal accessibility, across the digital and physical, urban infrastructures. And I think part of this is all got to do with we kind of have to promote what I call participatory planning. You have to, these stakeholding groups must be brought together, so that there's participation in the planning, so there also has to be a much more broader definition of using inclusive data for all manner of users, not just kind of, your typical average profile user. It has to include a very broad, much broader profile of users, and it must be, as I said, it must, and you will find that there will be national disability frameworks. And so, as I said earlier about WCAG 2.1,
yep.
And the other thing is that multimodal interfaces, as I said, they're all out there, but people who are not, have a certain disability, I hate the word, but they're not aware of that, how important tactility is, as Chris would be as a blind person, how it's acutely sensitive to your temperature changes, and surface variations. People are just not tuned into that, so people who are designing these systems, aren't, and so these people are implementing.
Frazer, can I ask you, I noticed when I was flipping through your LinkedIn profile earlier that you did some work in healthcare. Are you seeing healthcare and social care driving part of this? Because in terms of finding funding to invest in this, these are two massive areas for most countries, UK, Ireland especially. Is that something? Are you seeing that as part of the smart city push?
Yeah, so I did a lot of work in healthcare. Mostly I was focusing on, I set up a company to do this, basically to develop an ICT bubble to enable people to do home dialysis, hemodialysis, as opposed to peritoneal dialysis. So hemodialysis means that you have a bloodline coming in to your vein and you have to cannulate self. So the idea was that most people do dialysis in clinics. They do the mandatory minimum, which is 12 hours a week. That just basically cleans the blood. And it actually, there's a huge number of problems associated with accessing these clinics. And the amount of time is not really sufficient. At the end of the day, they should be doing more of it. And the way was, I developed a system to basically help people to do that in their homes. And basically it was ICT system using multimodal interaction, using video, using biometrics readings that would tell your heart rate, and then it would automatically trigger a nurse response. So basically a nurse would be managing the patients remotely as opposed to in the clinic, and people could dialyze whenever they liked. And actually it got very much into the nitty-gritty of how you design a system for somebody who is doing dialysis, how you design a training application, both for the nurses and the teachers who are basically teaching them how to do this, and how they themselves have to use it. So I've done a lot of work in the medical area, and yes, there are big changes coming, and it's becoming more normal. At the time, of course, the large medical companies weren't particularly interested in home dialysis because a dialysis machine cost 20 grand, and they didn't want to be putting one of those in the homes when they could rent it out for 3 turns a day in a hospital. So there was a whole kind of an economic issue that I was too naive to realize the basic economics from the medical perspective. But that's changing because there's no budgets now, and people have to, there's a big push now to get people out of the hospital. So digital technology is having digitalization of the medical environment for the care from out of hospital to home is having a huge development at the moment, for want of a better term. There is a push for it. COVID demonstrated that they couldn't manage people in the hospitals, So yes,
Yeah.
to answer your question, the medical area is an area where the management, in-hospital management as well, and for instance, bed apps, managing more bed allocations more efficiently and all the rest of it. I could. There is a push to digitize this process of helping people become more autonomous from the hospital in the home to satellite clinics, and trying to keep them out of it because they're susceptible to I suffer from asthma, so if I'd gone into a hospital, I would have picked up a respiratory disease. Me, I had to stay out. During COVID, I was completely locked down. Yes, there is big changes in the medical area, and I do see it as related, but I don't see it as a medical issue. I see it as a societal responsibility. I'm not looking at. I see it as a cultural, as Monica was saying earlier, there's lack of a cultural awareness of just how lucky we all are who don't suffer from disabilities,
Okay, Frazer, final question for you, because Monica's going to shout at me in a minute because we've gone over time. Any smart cities around the world that you look at and you think they're doing it right? Because I think we all agree. Certainly, I look at London. Some aspects are good, and from what you said, Dublin, you're pushing for more. Are there some of the emerging cities that you'd say you look up to and go, they're really getting it right?
Yeah. So there are, Barcelona is pretty, in terms of best practice. Barcelona at least uses what they call participatory budgeting, and that includes inputs from disability advocates in their city planning, and they have a kind of a smart city. It's quite impressive. The data center there, where they can aggregate all the data, IoT and less LoRa gateway sensor data, and so Barcelona have this component, and I would give them a lot of credit for that. Singapore, I was impressed. They had a real-time bus information system with ADI alerts and wheelchair accessible transport. So Singapore is pretty good. Has done some work in the sort of the smart city context. Toronto did try a number of years ago, but there was an issue. It was a company called Sidewalk Labs, and there was an issue about the use of the data, and so the city fathers got a little bit, concerned that the data was being taken away, was being used, and mightn't be necessarily protected. So that didn't go, and that is there. So you touched upon it. The data privacy is a big issue, but we are getting around that, because there was an issue, in Ireland about the videos, the surveillance from the police, anonymizing that, because obviously there was a GDPR, and the EU, I think, is realizing that they're hindering innovative research in smart cities, and they're going to have to try and find a route around it. But yeah, privacy is an issue, but it also goes back to if you offer people greater access and safer movement, and as long as they feel that their data is being protected, then I think they will accept it, and we can get around the privacy issues, because it comes to individually, you know what I mean?
Yep, it's those guardrails around AI and data and stuff like. Right, Monica, we've gone over time. Take us home.
Yes. So I have many more questions, but we'll save them for another podcast. So Frazer, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Chris.